if you can just introduce yourself, tell our audience who you are, what brought you to, or maybe just what's bringing you to Carbondale, particularly your new book, that would be wonderful.
My name is Mattilda Bernstein Sycamore, writer, editor, and activist, and I'll be in Carbondale to give the National Coming Out Day keynote talk at Southern Illinois University, and that'll be on Friday, October 11th, 4:30 p.m. And I'll be talking about my new book, which is called The End of San Francisco. It's a memoir.
I'm interested in your writing style, particularly how you write in a nonlinear fashion, and how your writing style maybe speaks to a queer politic in some way.
Well, with The End of San Francisco, I struggled a lot in writing the book in figuring out what to call it, because I knew it was nonfiction, but I wasn't sure, what am I going to call it? I decided to call it a memoir in spite of the fact that most memoirs, I think, have the uncanny ability to take the most complicated, interesting, multifaceted lives and turn them into these prepackaged, laminated timelines, right? And I think, we have enough placemats in the world, and I think we need to create something more interesting. I think when I'm dead and in the ground, if you want to fly over, in a helicopter plotting my life from A to Z, that might make some sense. But until then, my life goes in all directions. And so for me, in choosing to write in a nonlinear style, I want to level the playing field, and so I want to be able to talk about all of the layers of experience. So whether that be, sexual desire, or whether that be an incest flashback, or listening to the radio, or something that happened 10 years ago, or something that's going to happen tomorrow, or, bad sex, or, some kind of experience, I want it all to be there. And especially in this book, which sort of circles around my formations and their undoing, so politically, socially, sexually, emotionally, and ethically, I'm really sort of circling around all these moments that have made and unmade me. And I don't want to impose, any kind of narrative clarity where it might not exist. And I think for me, the possibility of engaging in a queer politic or a queer life is in, challenging all hierarchies, in creating something fluid and transformative and mesmerizing and defiant that challenges all of the dominant norms. And I think one of those norms actually is the idea that we have to package our lives in order to make them interesting to what is supposedly the center. I think we hear that a lot in publishing, where if you're on the margin, say if you are a queer person or a trans person or whomever that doesn't fit into what is supposedly the center. So they call the center that's, white, Christian, so-called middle America, or it's, Harvard-educated elite, sort of high culture dominance, right? So if you don't conform to one of those things, you're supposed to, explain your life and how did you get to these horrible, degraded, desperate, and weird, places. And for me, that takes away the power of the writing. And so for me, writing in a nonlinear way is writing on my terms and making the reader enter on those terms. And I think that is a queer politic in that sense, a queer politic that says that actually people relate more if we express the complications in our lives, if we express the contradictions, the places where we failed, rather than a sort of smiling, happy, we're just like you kind of spoon-fed, normalcy.
Not only do you motivate me to continue my writing, but it also challenges me to really think about even some of the models that I may be slipping into in ways that maybe I'm not really aware of, or at least it asks me to be more aware of some of those models that I might slip into. And in terms of the title of your book, The End of San Francisco, can you say a little bit about where that title comes from? What's the significance of this title?
San Francisco has been the most formative place for me. I first moved to San Francisco in 1992 when I was 19, And I was fleeing, 1 year at an elite East Coast university, and I left because I wanted to find radical queer outsider culture. I wanted to find direct action activism. I wanted to find freaks and outlaws and incest survivors and vegans and anarchists and dreamers and instigators who wanted to challenge the violence of the world around us and try to create something else. Mm-hmm. And so San Francisco is where I really found my foundations as, a queer person, creating culture and love and lust and activism and community on my own terms, and searching for other people like me and also challenging the violence of straight or gay normalcy, and San Francisco is also the place that has let me down the most. And so what I wanted to do, in the title of the book, The End of San Francisco, in some ways I'm asking a question about, the end of San Francisco as a place where marginalized queers can find a place to cope, and I mean that in a larger way, the sort of, I think over the last couple decades, the sort of decimation of the queer imagination in San Francisco due to many factors, AIDS and gentrification and assimilation in particular. Uh-huh. But I also, beyond that, the book is really very personal. So I'm sort of talking about my own life, as a lens for looking at everything else. And the places where, over the years I've been involved, in a lot of direct action activism, a lot of, queer community building in writing and editing anthologies that, sort of, instigate a kind of radical, incendiary kind of queer politic into the sort of deadening numbness of the sort of gay mainstream. But at the same time, I find over and over again that these queer worlds that we create often end up mimicking the violence of the worlds that we're trying to challenge. And so in the book, I'm sort of investigating how these places where I keep finding myself lost, over and over and over again.
I'm interested kind of in the urban-rural divide, particularly living in a place here in Carbondale where my partner and I have now been going on about 3 years now, and how this rural space, I think, offers a different type of horizon. It offers new possibilities for, I think, queer ways of being, particularly living off of the land and what have you. And I'm wondering if you can maybe give some thoughts on kind of that urban-rural divide that kind of gets shored up, I think, in some discussions, meaning that San Francisco is supposed to be the place where we're supposed to go, but maybe there's other places to be.
I think for me, the possibility of a queer politic for me is in creating more choices, not fewer, right? So I think if we take a look at sort of a mainstream gay politic, right, what it says is, conform or be pushed to the margins and forced to die, right? So it's taking on the sort of dominant signs of straight conformity and repackaging them as the ultimate measures of gay success. Mm-hmm. And so a queer politic for me, I don't want to create something else that is just as formulaic and tired and packaged. We need to be creating more opportunities for people to be flamboyant and to create transformative lives and accountability and intimacy and negotiation and trust and, possibilities for gender and sexual and social and political self-determination everywhere, right? Yeah, and so that may look different, in a smaller place rather than in a big city, but I don't think either one should be prioritized. And unfortunately, I think sometimes the way people end up talking about a sort of rural-urban queer divide is in saying that the rural is more conservative and therefore the urban needs to be toned down in order to fit into the mold of this more conservative realm. Mm. And I think for me that's unfortunate, I think, because we both have a lot of things to learn from one another. And those things do not involve, if they do involve conforming to either, the violence of, straight normative lives, or of the smiling, happy, we're just like you, like hyper-patriotic gay normalcy, then I think that's not worthwhile. If it is about conforming to that, then I'm not interested in it. What I am interested in is, where do we find the ways that we can create something else? Where do we find the ways to challenge the status quo wherever we are? Wherever we choose to be, wherever we're forced to be, wherever we end up, purely by circumstance. And I think for me is where the possibilities lie.
You're talking quite a bit about, at least the queer politics for you is about more choices, more access to these choices, and how you enact your own kind of queerness. And I think that when we talk about the way that you've articulated your own memoir here in your new book, The End of San Francisco, I think that you have offered to us one possibility, right? That you offer maybe not an exact blueprint for others, but showing us a certain way that one has maneuvered or navigated, I think, various terrains, whether it's a heteronormative world or whether it's like the normativity of gay politics as well. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the use of emotion as a way of describing this, or maybe even emotion as a form of articulating these larger systemic kind of practices. I'm thinking here of the use of gay shame, for instance, or even the use of trauma, for instance.
Over the years, I think I've become more and more drawn to expressing vulnerability. I think when I was first, entering the world, well, actually, even before I was entering the world as an avowedly queer person, I had to figure out a way, growing up in an abusive family, going to a school where, it was a liberal, affluent school that was, violently homophobic, and, internalizing the notion that, if I never wanted to, I knew, I was called faggot when I was, say starting around age 4, and so for me, in order to survive, I had to cultivate an invulnerability, right? Mm-hmm. And a sense of that I could walk down the street and someone could shoot me in the face and I would just walk right on. I'd just be like, oh, honey, please, and surviving a lot of violence, being sexually abused by my parents, just growing up in this world, as a flamboyant queer person and being persecuted for that, the only way I could ever find other queers was to cultivate that invulnerability. And I think I'm in a different place now where I feel like the only way I'm going to find people who I can relate to and how we can sort of talk the places where we fail one another and create something else is by expressing vulnerability. And so in writing this book, The End of San Francisco, I was really drawn toward the places where my analysis stops, talking about the things that I never thought I would be able to talk about, and I think and also, I think in activism is a form, at least the activism I've done, over the years, say, either in ACT UP in the early 90s, or in Fed Up Queers in New York in the late 90s, or in Gay Shame in both New York and San Francisco, it was definitely about cultivating invulnerability. And direct action activism, I think, generally is about invulnerability. It's about pretending that we have power in order to actually create space, and channeling a sort of sense of invulnerability even when we know that we are vulnerable. And I think in writing this book, even in talking about activism, I'm doing it in a different way. In the past I've written, say some of my anthologies or political essays, they're very calculated and I'm talking about the politics. In The End of San Francisco, I want to talk actually about the relationships that formed the politics, and the gaps, the places where I thought, here I'm actualizing my politics by creating relationships through activism, intimacy through political engagement, trust through direct action projects. But then in the end, they ended up failing me anyway. And so I want to circle back around that and ask, well, where was that failure? And I think similarly, perhaps, talking about surviving childhood abuse, for me, being able to express that vulnerability, paradoxically, I think what I've learned is being able to express the vulnerability actually makes me feel safer. I didn't have the possibility of doing that when I was 12 or 15 or maybe not even 18, but now I do. Now I can create the world more closer to being on my own terms. And I think the only way to make the world make more possible for kids who are growing up, in abusive families, going to, homophobic, transphobic, violently, abusive schools and growing up in this world that wants them to die or disappear, I think the sort of mainstream gay movement tells us that we have to say, for example, that it gets better, right? It's like, oh, well, your parents are beating you. You go to school and your teacher says you're worthless. And then you go out on the street and someone, says you deserve to die. Just hold on for a few more years and it's going to get better, right? And, I think that camouflages the violence that's actually happening and allows it to keep continuing. We need actual structural change that gets queer kids out of abusive families, that changes schools and makes them serve queer kids, that changes the larger world and doesn't succumb to its, violence and say, well, just hold on for a few more years and eventually, you're going to get a job at Google or Pixar or the San Francisco Police Department, and so I think we actually need to talk about well, what about when you finally do get the hell out of high school and you go to a gay bar and no one will talk to you because you're fat or because you're the wrong race or the wrong gender or, because you don't look able-bodied enough or, you don't have, the right kind of abdominal muscles, and then you get there and you're like, well, wait a second, what happens if it gets better? Now I'm in a world that maybe is even worse. I mean, at least I have my own autonomy, but how I feel like so much of gay culture teaches queer kids to not have autonomy, and to conform to something just as vapid and gross and consumerist and empty as dominant straight culture. And part of that is, I think, this idea, this sort of we have arrived, this sort of success story, And what if we talked about, well, actually, I'm still really, maybe you get to age 40 and you realize, well, now no one will talk to me, or 60 and you don't even exist anymore, in a sort of gay or even queer world. And, or maybe that starts at age, 16 or 18 or, it's like, how do we talk about these places of failure or the places of, well, wait, maybe I thought I found everything I wanted, but I'm still horribly depressed and I still feel completely alone, How do we talk about that, instead of saying it gets better, how do we make it better? How do we change things? How do we create more possibilities for everyone, not just for certain people who are willing or able to conform to, white middle-class norms?
We recently saw the overturning of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, that, we're told is supposed to be a good thing. And then on the flip side, we now see that there's money being funneled in by one particular wealthy trans person, $1.35 million, to prove that there's going to be nothing wrong if we now include trans people into the military. Can you, just from your own experience, talk a little bit about maybe this particular politic for our audience, perhaps, that maybe just doesn't understand maybe how this can be problematic, the inclusion of more bodies into this military system?
I remember actually going to the March on Washington in 1993. It was called the March on Washington for Lesbian, Gay, and Bisexual, freedom, or I'm not sure. They probably didn't use the word freedom. That would be too challenging. But that was the moment where sort of gays in the military emerged as a dominant issue in mainstream gay politics, soon overshadowed by marriage. But, those are the two central issues over the last 2 decades. And I think nothing could be more problematic than the idea that inclusion in the U.S. military is a sign of progress, right? I mean, the idea that being able to go abroad and kill, unarmed people of color in vicious wars of aggression for corporate profit and imperialism, is not progress. If you're able to, fly a rainbow flag while you're, obliterating villages in Iraq or Pakistan or Afghanistan or wherever, where is the progress there? And I think nothing to me could be more hideous than that whole fight over gays in the military and the notion that accessing one of the most fundamental institutions of oppression in the world, that accessing that institution without changing it is a form of progress. I think if we look at this country, if there's one thing holding back progress in this country, it's the U.S. military. If we just took half of the U.S. military budget, it would probably still be the largest military overwhelmingly in the world, and we would be able to fund every single thing that we want in this country, whether that be housing or health care or, gender self-determination or, food on the table for everyone or anything. It's all being funneled into the U.S. military. And the U.S. military is just a killing machine, And, now you can press buttons in Nevada or Syracuse and obliterate villages in Somalia. Is it a sign of progress if an openly gay or trans person can push those buttons? No. I mean, it's just becoming part of a violent, atrocious institution. And I think it's so shocking to me. I mean, overwhelmingly shocking over and over again how grotesque, the sort of mainstream so-called LGBT movement becomes. It's almost as if there's no place for satire anymore because everything that we imagine, the most absurd, hypocritical, grotesque, sort of posturing is actually happening. So, I mean, I think this example of the idea of trans inclusion in the U.S. military is just the most, I'm just if I had to create, a joke, it'd be oh, what are they going to do after they allow gay people in the military? Well, now they're going to talk about trans inclusion in the U.S. military. And I think this sort of watching right now, I mean, for me, the possibility of a trans politic, or even just say the word transgender, it's about undoing hierarchies. It's about creating, more possibilities for gender self-determination, whatever that is, across the entire spectrum, and I think nothing in the world could be about creating fewer possibilities, about annihilating the possibilities for people around the world than the U.S. military.
Yeah.
And the idea that becoming part of a dominant institution of oppression, whatever it may be, the military, marriage, the police force, without changing that institution, the idea that is progress is atrocious. I mean, yes, of course we know that abused queer kids, there are queer and trans kids, all over the place, joining the U.S. military to annihilate, to try to get the hell away from their parents that don't have options. But because what we need to be doing is creating more options to not have to join a killing machine in order to get away. You're worried your parents are going to kill you, and so you go abroad and kill someone else. That's not progress, And I think, it's really sad for me to see the way that a trans movement, it took a while, I think for, let's say, if we go back, there's always been a tension in queer or gay politics between a sort of assimilationist, we're just like you kind of mentality, and a more liberationist politic, that is about undoing hierarchies and challenging the violence of the world around us and creating more possibilities. And I think because, let's say, until maybe about 2 decades ago, before that, it wasn't actually that possible even for mainstream gay people to still be gay in the world and still claim all of their power. And so there was a little bit of solidarity between a more liberationist and a more assimilationist politic. Over the last 20 years, that's changed. There's no more solidarity. The mainstream politic is about erasing the potential for everyone else. And to see, certain trans people and institutions joining in, for me, is so misguided, so atrociously absurd. The majority of trans people, in this country have no power, no access. Like, talk about trans kids who are, running away from home, who end up, strung out on the street and addicted to drugs and, engaged in survival sex just to survive. That is a standard trans narrative. Those are the people we need to be talking about. What about trans women who are overwhelmingly in prison in this country,
Right.
And people, and now people are talking about, well, trans women in the military? Are you joking? This is the most absurd thing I have ever heard in my life. What we need to be talking about is abolishing the U.S. military, at the very least, taking away the vast majority of its resources so we can redistribute those resources and, create the possibilities that we need for everyone.
Now, and I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about the LGB and the T and how both of these worlds continue to benefit mutually from one another as a politic, as activist strategies. At least my partner and I, we continue to experience resistance, I think sometimes, or a divide that is so painfully, I think, false and misled between lesbian, gay, bi, and trans, as if to say that they're completely different politics.
This sort of acronym, LGBT, I think, at its initiation was really about gay with lesbian in parentheses, throw out the bisexuals and put trans on for a little bit of window dressing. And I think over the years, perhaps the lesbian and the gay have sort of coalesced to a certain extent. I still think actually bisexual is not really part of that institutional power structure for the most part. Mm-hmm. And trans is really still about window dressing, and I think, but what's sad to me now is to see trans institutions emerging that are following the exact same model. So the failure of the mainstream, I'm going to call it the mainstream gay movement, is that it is about this narrow identity politic, so it says that identity is an endpoint, right? So that's how you can see something like marriage or military, and you just put gay on it, and suddenly, that's the central issue. And then if you say something about housing or healthcare, well, no, that's not a gay issue. We have to talk about gay marriage and gays in the military. And instead of identity as a starting point, and I think for me, that's the possibility of a queer politic. If you take identity is really important. Mm-hmm. It's how we find one another. It's how we express ourselves in the world. But we need to be using it as a starting point for challenging the larger world. It's not an endpoint. And I think that's the real possibility across all of these divides, of race and class and gender and sexuality and social political identity, Mm-hmm. And in queer world, I think we have so much more in common when we actually talk about the issues that matter, Yeah. Mm-hmm. Like if we're talking about homeless queers, or if we're talking about AIDS services, or drug treatment, or gender, sexual, social, political self-determination, or, creating safe houses for queer youth to escape abusive homes, or comprehensive sex education, or fighting against U.S. wars of aggression, or, fighting for restructuring of the U.S. immigration system, no borders rather than creating more borders, and that's where the real potential lies for me.
How does your text perhaps offer a glimmer of hope in that it's not too late, that we've lost the, quote, battle, right, that there's still an anti-assimilationist potential in the world right now?
Well, it's interesting. In writing The End of San Francisco, in a lot of ways, it is a memoir of loss. It is, in some ways, about loss of hope. And one of the things I realized in editing the book, I'm looking at my own story, right, and the circling around these formative moments. And I keep seeing the ways in which I keep believing in the same or very similar politic, right? A sort of radical queer politic of, creating hope on the margins, challenging the violence of dominant straight or gay normalcy, of trying to find one another and creating new ways of loving and lusting for and taking care of one another that are not predicated on dominant institutions of oppression. And in some ways, I wonder at times, I'm like, if I keep believing in these same values, values of accountability and mutuality and negotiation and intimacy, creating relationships that go deeper and deeper, and when you feel like you've revealed everything, you try to find something else. That kind of relationship model, I wonder, well, why do I keep believing in this? And sometimes I wonder, is it just delusional, And I think people have told me that in reading the book, they find that hopeful. So hopefully it is. Perhaps it's both.
I thank you very much for the interview. I'm wondering, not really wondering at this point, is there anything else that you'd like to offer to the audience?
No, well, I'm really looking forward to reading from the book and talking to people in Carbondale and hearing people's questions and having a conversation.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I do appreciate it.
Thank you. It was really fun.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.